comes on. But yeah, that was good.
Can you hear me if I do this?
It was good when you had those ones on, the ones pointing upwards.
Right.
Because it had some light reflecting putting onto my left side.
So you can get those
These ones pointing upwards.
Yeah, that's not really going to go very far because there's a whole load of cables underneath there.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It's kind of pointing here.
Yeah.
It's like the one that's there. Well, at least I don't. Do you know if those ones at the back are off?
Actually, what's that? So it gives a bit more. That's probably better having something over here in case anybody's a real walker.
Yeah. Yeah, there.
Yeah, I think that's.
That's the reason.
Very nice.
Yeah. That was all. Yeah.
Okay.
Resolved all the assets.
That far one.
Yeah.
So the far left.
Yeah. That's alright. That is. Use me as a
Yeah.
Hey hey, 2-2, hey hey, bang bang, hey hey, 2-2, hey hey. Okay, so
I'll just pop these down so tell me which one you need to.
cool, yeah. Cool.
Start with cool one. Sorry, go warm one.
Warm one.
Warm two. Can we just pop it down for a second?
Yep.
Just check warm three. Okay, warm it down.
Yeah, good.
What if I move around into the natural light? Yeah. Is that it?
And she'll go well with Christine, because Christine's bubbly, she's bubbly. That's what Christine's first colleague as well, isn't it?
Well, I think the students can.
I think so. Well,
It's not the girls necessarily, it's the boys.
I think sometimes two people in the girl people do.
Well, I'm afraid they've got to mix it up a bit because some of them are.
Yes, they get.
Yes, it's got a real range of stuff, but it's just the two of us. Three video games, two videos, headphones, doing stuff. So it keeps on our toes. Previously, it's funny to when I was, still
Currently, I've just got that.
Yeah, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Yeah. Good. Yeah. 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 Good. Oh, nice to meet you.
Hi everyone. You guys participating in the post-Islam session? Yeah. Okay. I'm about to ask you guys to queue up. So you have to queue up here based on the alphabetical order of the poster title. So I'll call out your name. So yeah, and then you have to come to the center and then present for 1 minute. And after that, when your time is up, just move your way to the next side of the auditorium or wherever. Okay. So, right. The first one, the first person in the queue is Andrew Keynes. And then the next one is Angie Wilson. Angie? No? The third one is Guy Anderson, who is not here yet. And then Marika Malin. Hui Yuan Xie. Hui Yuan. And then after that, Ding Xiang. Yeah, well, you are the fourth. You're one of the fourth. So Hui Yuan Xie, Ding Xiang, Olivia Friedman, Silvana Mareva, no? Courtney Swaley, Kylie Clarkson, James Algie, sorry. Lane Nguyen, Danyang Zhang, Yani Chang, Yani, no? Guy Adrian B. Alright, hi. Benedict, so is that how I pronounce it? Zubel? Okay. Özturk? Özge? No? Not here yet? Okay. Then Danielle Saunders. Edis Sohoglu. Please tell me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, okay? Yingtan Wang. Grace Rice. Oriana. Rocco Chill.
Yes.
With Katie Howard. Rebecca Jackson? No? Okay. Kate Neal.
Yes.
And then the last one, Anthony Lee. Okay. Right. Please try to get to know people in front of you and behind you. So again, Andrew Keynes. Guy Anderson is not here. So Marika Malin, Hui Yuan Xie, Ting Ting Xiang, Olivia Goodman, Silvana Mareva. Kylie Clarkson, James Algie, Lei Mui, Daniel Zhang, Guy Edwin Lee, Benedict Zulfa, okay. Ozia Oster, who is not here, Daniel Saunders, Edis Sohoglu, Ying Han Wang, Grace Rice, Grace, you're not, oh no, Oriana, right? Oriana Bayraktari, Rokuchio is not here, Katie Howard, Rebecca Jackson, Kate Neal, and Anthony Lee. Okay. So, when I call out your name, when you hear your name, please come to the center with the microphone. Not yet. Not yet. Like for 1 minute. So, okay. So I'm going to explain to the audience what the poster slam is and what they should do, which is to have a power clap. Okay, and then yada yada yada, and then I'll be like, so then after that I would say, what do you call it? All right, so let's invite our first presenter, Andrew Keynes, who will be talking about his research projects. Okay, the moment you start talking, I will, no, just come. And then the moment you open your mouth, I will click on the slide, which will be timed, okay? All right.
Let's mention this.
Oh, okay, starting?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm presenting 3 posters today, all of them funded by the Incubator Fund, which is funded by the Isaac Newton Trust. So I just want to firstly thank them and also point out that these are all internships we did this summer, and they're cross-disciplinary across education, computer science, and MML. First of all, we've got a literature review for the new Language, Brains and Machines Research Network. We then have an app for testing and teaching numeracy and literacy skills. And finally, a game to collect linguistic judgments. So please come and see my posters.
No, one power clap, one clap. All right, okay. Next, we have Angie Wilson, who will be talking about developing prototype assistive listening technology for remediating developmental dyslexia.
Hello. Children with developmental dyslexia have trouble identifying and manipulating parts of words. What lies behind this? Well, at the CNE, our research suggests we have issues with low-level neurological and sensory auditory processing. Our poster today will show a targeted intervention approach where we will boost the low-level speech content of the intervention. This will be for dyslexic children in primary school in 2 forms, either as age-related literacy material or as a music and poetry intervention. We will use EEG and MEG to look at the impact. Please come and see our poster if you'd like to know more.
Well done. Okay. Then we have Marika Meling, who will be sharing with you about creating a corpus of multilingual accounts from London Bridge 1380 to 1480.
Hi, in this...
Sorry. There you go.
In this 3-week incubator project, we created a procedure to annotate a corpus of 15th century London archives. How the English language standardized is still not really understood, but we do know that in the 15th century, medieval English, Latin, and Anglo-Norman French were mixed. And not only that, but we also have intricate abbreviations and suspension symbols in the manuscripts that blend the 3 languages together. So we developed an annotation procedure starting with normalization of the text, trying to preserve all these intricacies. And we followed by having 2 separate automatic tagging procedure, one for language and one for the part of speech tags. And finally, we merged all the annotation together, making it available along with the metadata in various formats. And we tested this and created an annotation manual so it can be extended.
Okay. Next, we have Hui Yuanxie, who will be presenting How clever are the models exhibiting superhuman performance on VQ8 datasets?
Hello, I'm Huiyang from Computer Lab. Recently, many AI models have been reported with very high performance on various tasks. Visual question answering is one of such tasks. But have you ever wondered, are those models really that clever, or are they simply taking advantage of subtle biases contained in the datasets? For instance, simply answering yes to all yes-no questions results in an accuracy of more than 70%. This is why we think there is a need to use synthetic data to evaluate AI models and see how well they understand different linguistic patterns. So please do come to see our poster to find out more.
Then we have Jingting Xiang, who will be telling you about indefinite NPs as subjects in L2 and L3 Mandarin grammars.
Hello. Our current world is no longer a world of bilingualism. A large number of people, and I'm sure that includes you, speak more than 2 languages. With a third language, a natural question is in what way 3 languages interact with each other in one human mind. Our poster presents a comparison between Mandarin as a third language by Cantonese English bilingual speakers, and Mandarin as a second language by English native speakers, and Mandarin as a first language by Mandarin native speakers. Our data tell a story about one of the major tasks in research on third language acquisition, that is to identify which previous language, the first language, the second language, or both, play a more prominent role, and why.
Thank you. Okay. Up next, Olivia Goodman will be talking about indirect corpus applications, collecting data and using it in ELT materials development.
Hi. So quite a few years ago, I was talking to my Spanish friend. I was hungry, and I said that I fancied a snack, and I used the word tentempié, and she laughed and said I sounded like her grandparents. And at first, I was embarrassed. I didn't understand what I'd said wrong. And when she told me, I realised that I'd learnt this word from my school Spanish teacher, who hadn't lived in a Spanish-speaking country for over 20 years. So had she been teaching me outdated Spanish, the Spanish that she had learnt many years before? And as a student, I expected that I'd be taught the language that's most relevant and most useful to me. And this happens time and time again, and we all know that languages change over time. But what exactly has changed? So to address this in English, we decided to build a corpus of spoken British English, the BNC 2014, analyse it and compare the findings to the BNC 1994. And now we have started using these insights to inform our course materials so that students and teachers are being exposed to relevant, natural and authentic language.
Okay. We then have Silvana Mareva, who will be talking about interesting... Courtney, sorry. Okay, after this we have Courtney Frolick, who will be presenting her work on investigating mechanisms of change in children's social attributional thinking, a frame semantics approach to social-cultural discourse analysis.
Sarah sees the new student sitting alone on the playground and says to her friend, "He must be a loner." This is correspondence bias, the tendency to attribute someone's behavior to a personality trait or a disposition without properly considering the context. We know this biased attributional thinking develops between 4 and 6 years, and that it's a precursor to social stereotyping. I wanted to know how we might intercept the emergence of this bias. So I partnered with teachers in Cambridge to work towards broadening children's social thinking in the context of dialogue around stories. I deconstruct the dialogue through a unique combination of frame semantics and sociocultural discourse analysis. I hone in on the shifts in frames of understanding and the ways in which teachers move children's thinking away from "he's naughty, she's a crybaby, he must be a loner," to more nuanced explanations of behavior and perhaps more open-minded attitudes towards others. Thank you.
Next, Kylie Clarkson will be sharing with you language processing of personal beliefs.
We know that during language processing, a semantic mismatch can lead to a brain response known as the N400. This is basically your brain going, hey? And what we at the Believing Brain Project are interested in finding out is how this kind of mismatch comes about when it's a mismatch with our personal beliefs. So we want to know things like when we integrate a word into a sentence which causes the meaning of that sentence to contradict our religious beliefs, like in the examples at the top, do we still see an N400? And does the very personal nature of belief mean that we see changes in frontal alpha asymmetry, which we know is linked to emotion? We also ask whether we see differences between statements of belief and statements of fact. If you'd like to know more about how we plan to explore these questions, please come see poster 12.
Then we have James Algie, who will be talking about L2 English genitive choices of L1 Spanish speakers.
To express a possessive relationship between two noun phrases, English allows two broad types of construction. So we have the Saxon genitive on the left and the prepositional construction on the right. This gives us the equally acceptable phrases, Britain's future and the future of Britain. Conversely, Spanish allows only one type of construction, which is equivalent to the prepositional in English. The two English constructions are not always interchangeable, and the key determining factor in a native speaker's decision is animacy, which makes Mary's bike much more preferable to the bike of Mary. Given this complex semantic system and cross-linguistic variation, it's unsurprising that Spanish speakers struggle to acquire the Saxon genitive in the early stages of learning. So to find out how these difficulties persist in the latter stages of learning, come and see my poster.
Up next, Lê Nguyen will tell you about matrix language variation in the Canberra corpus of Vietnamese English code switching.
So code switching is a phenomenon where a speaker uses more than one language in one single utterance. So for example, what did you have at school today was a Vietnamese English code switch sentence, meaning what did you learn at school today? So my research looks at structures in clauses. For example, do language A and language B contribute equally to the structures of the utterance? And if not, how do we identify which language contributes more? It also looks at whether the grammar of the bilingual speech actually changed over time as it passed through generations. So to investigate this, I built an original corpus of conversations from Vietnamese and English bilinguals living in Canberra, Australia. 46 speakers, 90,000 words, 10 hours of natural speech. If you want to know what the findings are, come to my poster.
Do you usually use a mobile-based dictionary? I would say next, Danyang Zhang will be presenting mobile-based dictionaries, investigating Chinese EFL learners' use and the effectiveness in incidental English vocabulary learning.
Do you usually use mobile-based dictionaries when you encounter new words? Have you ever expected that you can acquire some of them? Results of my study show that Chinese EFL learners prefer to read word definitions and pattern of speech. They especially only read one definition and Chinese translation if available. In comparison, the 9 English majors and the bilingual group prefer to use more than others. Mobile-based dictionary could help learner acquire vocabulary knowledge in terms of spelling, medium use, and pronunciation. In general, the English major and the monolingual group performed the best, while the non-English major and the bilingual group have made more progress. To conclude, there is a strong correlation between dictionary use and the vocabulary test performance. So do come to see my poster to know more how to make efficient use of mobile-based dictionary in your second language vocabulary teaching and learning. Thank you.
Next, we have Guy Aglionby telling you about modeling polysemy in distributional semantic models.
Hi, I'm Guy, and I work on modeling polysemy in natural language processing models. In NLP, we represent words as lists of numbers called embeddings, and these embeddings have the special property that semantically similar words have similar embeddings, and semantically different words have very different embeddings. However, with this model, we have the problem where the senses of each word get conflated into one representation. For example, the embedding for interest needs to be simultaneously similar to that of charge and curiosity, which should themselves be very dissimilar. To combat this, I create an embedding for each sense of each word using Word2Vec and information from WordNet and find that this gives performance improvements in the language modeling task. Thank you.
Then we have Benedict Zoffel, who will be talking about modulating speech processing with alternating current stimulation.
It has been shown in the past that the alignment between neural oscillations and speech is enhanced when the speech is intelligible, but it remains unknown whether this alignment is causally relevant for speech processing. To test this, we manipulated the alignment between oscillations and speech rhythm using transcranial alternating current stimulation, or TACS. We expected an optimal phase relation between TACS and speech that leads to a relatively improved speech comprehension and a relatively large bold response to speech as measured using fMRI, and vice versa, a non-optimal phase relation between TACS and speech that leads to a relatively impaired speech comprehension and a relatively small bold response. Did we find that oscillations are causally relevant for speech processing? Find out at poster number 18.
We then have Danielle Saunders, who will be presenting multiple sentence representations in machine translation.
Everyone's seen computers translating between human languages with varying success. Computers do this best when they combine proposed translations from more than one model in an ensemble. But what if one model in the ensemble produces a different representation, like this syntax example at the bottom? We know that different representations can be useful in translation. Syntax, for example, improves sentence structure. But because the representations can't be directly compared, it's difficult to use them in a translation ensemble. Our work uses a known mapping between representations to specifically combine syntax and word sequences into one translation form. And our poster shows our investigation into using those in multi-representation ensembles. Come and find out more.
After this, Eddie Sohoglu will be talking about neural coding schemes for lexically driven prediction in superior temporal cortex. Sorry.
Hello, yep. So, one influential theory in cognitive neuroscience proposes that listeners are continually making predictions about speech input, and it's the difference between what's predicted and the sensory input, so in other words, the prediction errors that are used to update previous predictions. In this study, we presented 21 listeners with bisyllabic spoken words in which the second syllable was strongly or weakly predicted by the first syllable based on long-term knowledge of words in English. By cross-splicing between items, we also manipulated whether the second syllable mismatched with the first syllable. We first constructed a computational model to characterize how prediction errors differed according to the prior strength and whether it mismatched or matched. Finally, we measured multivoxel neural response patterns with fMRI, and if the results of this analysis resemble those of the modeling, then that would suggest that actually listeners in fact do compute prediction errors.
Up next, Ying-Tan Wang will be sharing with you her work on predictive neural mechanisms, spoken word recognition and learning.
Listeners recognize familiar words in their native languages, which is speed and accuracy that is unmatched by that by artificial systems. And a mechanism that has been proposed to help achieving this is prediction. For example, if we hear the word block, and the next time we hear the initial sound block, block will be more accessible, which will help us predict its forthcoming. However, if what we actually hear is another familiar word, blot, or a new word, blog, then there will be a mismatch between what we predicted and what we actually hear. So this mismatch is called prediction error. And existing studies and models suggest that prediction error delays recognition of familiar words while enhances learning of new words. And we're interested in studying the role of prediction error in these two processes and how and where the brain signals prediction error through a series of behavioral and neuroimaging experiments. Welcome to the poster 24.
We then have Grace Rice sharing with you about semantic memory performance after left versus right anterior temporal lobe resection.
Hi, I'm Grace, and I'm interested in semantic cognition. By that I mean how we understand the meanings of words, how we recognise objects and people, and I'm particularly interested in where in the brain this process occurs and where this information is stored, and whether there are differences between the left and the right sides of the brain. So the poster I'm presenting is presenting some patient data in patients with epilepsy who have had either the left or right anterior temporal lobe resected, and we tested their semantic cognition to see if there were any differences between the two patient groups. And if you'd like to hear more about the tests we use or the findings, please come to poster 25.
After this, we have Oriana Bayraktari sharing with you the effects of language context on executive function, a pilot study.
It has been extensively proposed that bilinguals have both their languages active and need to suppress one to use the other. This is thought to offer them a benefit in interference suppression that extends beyond language use. Based on the adaptive control hypothesis, we investigate the different cognitive demands interactional context place in interference suppression and how bilinguals adapt to these demands. The interactional context we look at are single language context, where one language is used throughout the interaction, and dual language, where both languages are used but in separate sentences. In this pilot study, Greek-English bilinguals performed a flank task while listening to either a Greek or English dialogue, two single language conditions, or a mixed Greek and English dialogue, a dual language condition. Afterwards, there were also comprehension questions, and our initial results indicate that there are differences in cognitive demands in both interference suppression and dialogue comprehension.
Up next, Katie Howard will be sharing with you the school experiences of bilingual children on the autism spectrum.
Can you be bilingual if you're autistic? The answer is yes, but it's oversimplistic. So sit back and relax as I try to explain why being bilingual is good for the brain. For children with autism, the advice sometimes goes, just stick to one language and see how things go. But in fact, we are seeing that being bilingual gives children with autism a great chance to mingle. When their parents communicate in two different tongues, just using one can be a harmony unsung. So what is this study? I hear you all cry. Well, I interviewed children who brought tears to my eyes as they gave their perspectives on what life is like. As an autistic bilingual, it's like riding a bike. Once you get the technique, the wheels keep on turning. Two languages help their interaction and learning. So why does this matter? It's a very good question. Grab some tea and come find me at the great poster session.
Well done. Right, after this we have Rebecca Jackson telling you about her work entitled Towards a Computational Model of Controlled Semantic Cognition.
Semantic cognition is the controlled access and retrieval of multimodal conceptual knowledge. It's multimodal because you access the same information whether you read the word cat, hear a meow, or encounter a real life cat. We're interested in one architecture the brain must have in order to do these controlled semantic processes. We built 7 different architectures of neural network models and compared them on how well they could perform semantics.
Next, Kate Liu will be presenting her work entitled Towards Automatic Grammatical Error Detection of Non-Native Spoken Learner English.
Okay, that long title means what we want to do is we want to help learners of English, for whom English isn't their first language, speak more proficiently by giving them feedback on, for example, their language usage. And here we're looking at grammatical error detection, and we're taking a state-of-the-art system from the Alto Institute designed for written text and applying it to speech. So all should be fine, except speech isn't quite the same as writing. It's got all these horrible disfluencies. The good thing is there's no spelling mistakes, there's no punctuation. The bad thing is there's no punctuation. We also don't know where to segment it. And then just to make it harder, to do this automatically, we need to run a speech recognizer. And we've got all this learner English, which is really hard to recognize, so there's lots of errors. So come to my poster to find out more.
Finally, we have Anthony Lee, who will be presenting Why Are Asians Better in Mathematics? A Modern Investigation into Linguistic Relativity or Number Count.
Hello. Have you ever wondered why some Asians are better in terms of mathematics in their classrooms compared to their British counterparts? Well, this study looks at this sort of cross-linguistic study. It's based on the fact that the arguments that there might be differences in counting system between English and Chinese, in the sense that we count from 10 to 10, 1, and 10, 3, 10, 2 in Chinese, and in English we count from 10, 11, 12. Therefore, there might be a less robust base 10 system from developments in British students. So this study looked at primary school students and to look at the number comparison, the number estimation abilities. So please come to my poster if you want to look at whether counting transparency can account for the differences in early domain-specific abilities. Thank you.
So your content slides are already timed at 1 minute. So the moment it's over, you have to move. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's all. I think you guys can grab coffee on the stage here. Good luck.
Thanks.
That's all right. Yeah, check the time, so only the practice it's fine. So, the real poster slate is that. Okay. And so I have already sent my slides. But can we control the button? Oh, okay. So, okay. Then I think I have a motion in my slides, like 3 slides. So at the end, there's something that I show.
Only in nominal phrase, not in word. So you want to justify that these two languages will be So if you search like Cantonese and Mandarin, you can see like tone perception across English. There's a comparison. Like it's hard to say. Because I also checked before I focus on this research topic, I also checked and it not just in general, so language typology. So they say that if these two languages are mutually intelligible, if I speak it and if you speak Cantonese, I will be able to say yeah, so this is not just
you can understand because of the syntax and the grammar, the tenses as well.
Yeah, that's true. But if you say so, if you understand each word, even in Italian, for example, if you understand what does each word mean, you won't be stopped by the syntax.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
It's hard to really know the syntax or terminology.
Yeah, but if you said you want to see how trilingual, like whether trilingual speakers are better than bilingual speakers. So what's your
Yes, and most schools in Hong Kong in the past in the global times basically Myanmar is basically now they are having so I'm just looking at trying to look at more futuristic picture into how their that would be the framework utilized years. And first look at the comparison between Myanmar and Myanmar. There is evidence. So I'm trying to stimulate that situation by comparing Myanmar students, though Myanmar students to immigrants.
very much like what she's working on.
Yeah, actually, it's not a suggestion in the sense that the political tension already that rejects the education of high any so that's why
That's why you were focusing on
Yes, and also why the political advantage and the cost advantage. Really works on that.
So I think for last year you just read philosophy. You don't need to worry about the writing vocabulary.
Because the thing is that I don't like to read without the focus. So I actually
Oh, really?
Sure.
It's up to you. Yeah.
And I think that gives me a focus as well. Besides that,
I think it's more on the vocabulary. I mean, but not necessarily only phonetical difference, the vocabulary, the wording is different. So I feel that Cantonese is more like ancient Chinese. So maybe I'm not quite sure, but in ancient Chinese, each word can be used as a verb, so it's very flexible, it's much more than modern memory. But I feel that Cantonese has that kind of
I think that's, I know in terms of phonetics, actually, I haven't really looked at. In terms of phonetics, yes, we have a lot of confidence in changing the sound of the tone of used for visualization. But basically, there's a lot of people that's really possible. There's only the chronological change in terms of the tone. There's a bit of the accents change, but other than that, I think we
That's true. Only because that when we choose that meet together, it was touches to the second tone. And sometimes if you don't want to.
And questions, of course, the intonation questions, of course, you change a little bit.
Yeah. And the other is sometimes you want the focus on the word that is like it's not
Yes. So basically, I think we design something.
After we established the bilingual teaching,
yeah, the Chinese, we have
so it's basically because of that. So that's when.
I think so because his previous PhD graduate, she went to Chinese University, and she's I think but she graduated in 2013, 14.
So is it there's no assistant, there's no assistant.
I have some question about what type of profession she's very good. Especially this administrative stuff. That's why but something is not distinguished. Something is distinguished. From the art and
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's nice. This is my so this project has 6 branches. Project strand 1 is literature, strand 2 languages, and we are in strand 6, so multilingual communication. Oh no, we are in strand 5. We are looking at language specific factors, so linguistic factors.
I'm assuming one is
I'm not sure if she is a number. Yeah, Cambridge Yeah, she's like they left professor for her, like they invite her to be a professor. So she's anyway, and at that time I was like first PhD thinking I used to be so she gave her inaugural speech in Cambridge, and the topic is bilingual communication.
Yeah, the first speaker is a pleasure. An hour.
Okay.
I can just start on the back and data.
Give it 10 minutes, because I've got something for it, which I will think 1 minute, but I should finish it early.
Okay. Hello. Hi.
Okay, Athena. And yeah, hi. I'm here volunteer and I will go around the microphone at the end of the. But I don't know. Is there any technician that can show me a bit how it works? Yeah. Okay. Hello. How the phones are?
Can you show me how
I think it's after every. I'm hoping it'll take about 50 minutes. To be honest, it's 7 hours, but I've paid an hour.
Okay, so I'll go with an hour. Yeah,
I'll just give you a video or not.
All right.
I've got her one. Yeah, that's really
So when I was working with
Will you be here? Great. I'll give it. So,
and there was a conference that you could actually just conference and so listening So far, it's
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual symposium of Cambridge Language Sciences. I'm Jan Fitzsimpley. I'm a linguist from the School of Arts and Humanities, and together with Professor Anne Kopsteek, who is from the School of Technology, we direct the Interdisciplinary Research Center, Cambridge Language Sciences. This is it's a great pleasure to see so many of you here today. We have a very full program. I will be responsible for chairing the whole program, so you have to be kind to me and don't ask too many questions. Let me just a few housekeeping notes. There are no planned fire drills today, so if you do hear an alarm, please evacuate using the fire exit signs, and the assembly point is the courtyard. Please turn the sound off mobile phones so that we don't have disruption. And just to say, this is a no smoking building. There's a smoking area in the courtyard, which can be accessed from the gallery on the first floor. This year's symposium is, the title is Language Sciences and Health, and we are delighted to have 5 speakers to talk about different perspectives of how language and health interact. We start with the first talk, which is by Professor Usha Goswami from the University of Cambridge. She's a professor of cognitive developmental neuroscience, and she's the director of the Center for Neuroscience in Education. Usha is very well known for her work on dyslexia and reading, developmental dyslexia. She has worked on reasoning by analogy, and her goal in her research is to understand the brain basis of dyslexia and speech and language difficulties, and the potential utility of assistive listening technology coupled with music and rhythm-based behavioral interventions. We're delighted to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Yanthi. I'll be talking to you today in general terms about the research program that we've been pursuing in the Centre for the last 15 years or so. And the ideas that I'm going to present did originate in my work in dyslexia. But given that we're a general interest group in language across the board, I'm not going to take the chronological approach of how the studies followed each other. I'm going to try and take a chronological approach from the infant brain onwards, through the child's brain and then the reading brain, to try to illustrate more general implications of the research for other types of language research in university. So one of the first points to make is a simple point, but it's absolutely fundamental to understanding how the brain acquires language. Infants love language. It's the most engaging way of interacting with an infant. If you're ever with an infant and you're sitting there quietly and you're not making any overtures to communicate, the infant will start trying to prod you into communicating by making noises or handing you an object, because communication is really important in terms of learning and development. We also know that to support infant language acquisition, a special way of talking is used, and again this can be shown in every language that's been studied. So it was originally called motherese, now it's more commonly called parentese, but it has the same characteristics in every language. So this is just one representative study, and for now that Stanford has done a lot of this basic groundwork. But you can see that she had mother and father participants speaking to their babies in these 6 different languages, or well, 5 different languages to English. And she found that all the languages and all the genders as well showed these characteristics of speaking in a higher pitch, having a larger prosodic contours, or more amplification, exaggerated amplification in the speech, speaking more slowly, having longer durations in the words and longer pauses. And for a long time, people really focused on this pitch characteristic, the idea that the fundamental frequency must be really important for language acquisition, which is why it's highlighted in infant-directed speech. And today I want to think more about the second feature that's found across languages, which is this exaggeration of prosodic contour. So there are different ways of thinking about modelling the speech signal, and for a long time our science has been dominated by this model, the speech spectrogram. So we've got frequency on this axis, and we've got time along this axis. And these are the changes in frequency over time as somebody says the number words 9, 7, 2, 3, 2. So the N of 9 starts approximately here and finishes approximately here. And it's very clear looking at the spectrogram that one of the key cues is these rapid changes in frequency, which are particularly associated with the vowel. And so for a long time, research on infant language acquisition and also on language difficulties in children focused on these frequency-related cues, particularly rapid changes in frequency in the signal, because they were thought to be a possible source of individual differences. And it's only in the last couple of decades, really, that this alternative way of conceptualizing the speech signal, so now we've got amplitude, or loudness, or signal intensity on this axis, and time along here, and you can see that there are big changes in amplitude as somebody is speaking, of course, because it's a sound wave that's reaching your ear. And there's, for example, a large amplitude signal for the syllable of 9, then there's a sort of double amplitude signal for 7, where you've got more amplitude in the stressed syllable than in the unstressed syllable, 2, 3, 2. And amplitude modulation, if you study it in terms of well, what's it giving you perceptually, it's really giving you speech rhythm and prosodic structure. And so there's a growing recognition that this kind of way of modelling the speech signal might actually be important for individual differences. And one reason for thinking this is that the way to develop a successful cochlear implant is to give the so-called amplitude envelope, which is the sort of skin on the apple, so the sort of overall envelope within which all this sound energy is packaged, in just a few frequency bands to the human brain, and then eventually a deaf child will learn speech with a cochlear implant. So this speech envelope idea is effectively you take the raw waveform and then you think about the overall envelope within which those sound modulations are happening. So you also power weight it. And then you say, well, we can think about the brain being interested in the envelope of speech and also all the rapid temporal information that's packaged inside that envelope, so the so-called temporal fine structure. And I became interested in this because in children with developmental dyslexia, they have problems with phonology. And I read a paper saying that the rise time of that vowel in a syllable is a very important clue to speech rhythm. And rise times, I started studying, turn out to be absolutely fundamental to language processing by the brain. So here we've got the speech envelope, and now you can see that there are certain rise times or large increases in amplitude. And the important thing about those increases in amplitude is that they're acoustic clues to phonological structure. So for example, to where a syllable begins. We saw in 7, you've got a very large amplitude change for that first stressed syllable. So possibly diaphragms are also important for prosodic structure. So thinking about the speech amplitude envelope and its modulations, or its sort of large and less loudness, its amplitude modulations and their rise times, maybe that's important for individual differences in how children acquire language. The other thing that was really important in this research was that I read the PhD by Rich Turner, who's in our engineering department here, and he had been studying the amplitude modulation structure of natural sounds in the environment. So in particular, Rich was interested in sounds like water in a river, or bird song. He also modeled wind, fire. And his approach was to apply Bayesian modeling to unpack the statistical structure of these natural sounds. So it's like a kind of automatic machine learning that you just learn the structure that's in the input. And he found that for the natural sounds, so here we've got birdsong and here we've got the river, you could describe these structures in terms of amplitude modulation cascades. So you'd have amplitude modulations at different temporal rates or in different frequency bands, but they would be dependent on each other. There'd be these sort of larger statistical connections between who's modulating when and how quickly. You don't find those amplitude modulation cascades in a man-made sound. So this is a machine, and I should have said that the modulation rate goes from fast to slow this way in this particular diagram, because this was how Rich's code plots it. But you can see that the machine has just got the just happening at this one particular modulation rate, which happens to be 9 Hz there. Whereas for these more natural sounds, you've got this very rich nesting and cascading of the amplitude modulations. And with a PhD student, Vicky Leong, we thought, well, let's apply this modeling code that Richard developed to child and infant-directed speech. And just to give you a precursor, you can see that if we look at infant-directed speech recorded by a mother speaking to a 7-month-old infant, again we can see these very nice modulation patterns with particularly a lot of energy at roughly 2 Hz. So this is the slowest modulations, and then another band at around 5 Hz, and then less information in that particular signal. But it suggests that this could actually be important for the brain, because if this is how natural sounds are in the real world, when their language is another natural sound, it just happens to be the most complex that we have. So those are the top, that's a sort of taster of how I'm going to try and structure the talk then. First of all, thinking from an amplitude modulation perspective about why infant-directed speech and child-directed speech might be different from adult-directed speech, and why this might matter if we're measuring in the brain how the brain processes language. Secondly, with respect to child language disorders, so we have dyslexia, where phonology, there's a cognitive problem with phonology, that's the most obvious sort of cognitive phenotype. In specific language impairment, which is now called developmental language disorder, the primary problems seem to be with morphology. So I'm going to try and show you that if amplitude modulation structure is important for human language processing, well then we ought to be able to say something principled about phonology or morphology in terms of amplitude modulations. And then I'll finish by telling you about the research on dyslexia, which is actually what started me on this particular sort of road, because it's so important to remember that many brains in our world of language users are illiterate brains. And if you look at particularly the cognitive neuroscience of language, almost all of that literature, I would say 98% of it, is looking at the brains of highly trained literate people, usually university students, listening to language spoken by highly trained literate people. So again, if we're interested in the basic processes that underpin language speaking and comprehending across all of our human languages, we need to think about the start state as well as the end state. Okay, so the start state would be the infant. You're an infant, you're born, you start hearing language. Actually, you probably heard language for at least the last 3 months in the womb. You heard it through a fluid, which means that you heard mainly the low frequency modulations, the slower modulation patterns. But we already know that you learn enough language in the womb that you can recognize whether it's your mother or another female adult speaking to you. So that's been shown in experiments. What's the amplitude modulation structure of infant-directed speech like? So this is, again, a paper where Vicky analysed infant-directed speech, and it was spoken to 7-month-old, 9-month-old, or 11-month-old infants, compared to the same mothers when they were talking to the adult, which was the experimenter. And this is showing you now modulation rate on this axis. So we've got the slower modulations at this end and the faster here. So that's 2, that's 40. And this is the amount of power in the signal. And you should be able to see that the purple line, which is the adult-directed speech, looks different from the 3 lines for infant-directed speech. And this is statistically significant. So what we're finding is that, yes, if you look at adult-directed speech, you get the peak in the so-called theta band. So that's amplitude modulations that are occurring roughly 5 times a second, which is related to syllable production. But when you're looking at the infants, you get more energy relatively in the signal in the so-called delta band. And that's amplitude modulations that are fluctuating approximately twice a second. And there's very nice work in linguistics showing that across cultures, most speakers produce a stressed syllable twice a second. So some people have called this the stressed syllable rate, this 2 Hertz rate. It's certainly related to parsing stressed syllables from the speech stream, which I'll show you later. The other interesting thing about the infant-directed speech is that these amplitude modulation cascades that I was talking about, so the fact that that the signal has different temporal rates of amplitude modulation which are hierarchically nested and connected. So we can look at how the amplitude modulations at the delta rate, how closely synchronized are they with modulations at the theta rate, so that would be roughly 2 Hertz and 5 Hertz. Or we can look at how these faster theta rate modulations are synchronized with the fastest band, which is a gamma band or a beta low gamma, which are there in this speech signal. And again, you can now see a difference if you look at the infant-directed speech. We've got 90-month-old infants as well now, versus the adults. There's significantly less synchronization between the slower rates, delta and theta, in the adult-directed speech. And now this is showing you a frequency on this axis, which is effectively the lower frequency parts of the speech signal and the higher frequency parts that your ear can hear. So this is quite a difference, and we see the same thing reversed, as it were, here. We now see that there's relatively more synchronization when adults are speaking between these faster oscillatory rates or these faster amplitude modulations in speech compared to when they're speaking to an infant. So it suggests that infant-directed speech as an acoustic structure in terms of its amplitude modulation is exaggerating 2 things for the brain. There's more delta band energy, so there's more of this slow modulation structure. And there's also tighter phase synchronization between these 2 slow bands of amplitude modulation, which are roughly 2 Hertz and 5 Hertz, which basically give you information about syllable structure and rhythm. What about child-directed speech? This is actually where what Vicky did first. So we collected data from infant school teachers who were reciting nursery rhymes. They were actually doing it to a picture of children rather than to live children, but we wanted them to behave as they would in the classroom. We recorded all these nursery rhymes, so we had about 50 nursery rhymes, and then we tried applying the amplitude cascade modeling code that Richard developed and seeing whether we could describe English nursery rhymes in terms of their amplitude modulation structure. So here's an example from Vicky's PhD. So this is the nursery rhyme Mary, Mary, quite contrary. And again, you can see that each stressed syllable carries a larger amplitude modulation burst than each unstressed syllable. You can see some of the rise times here, like the qu at the beginning of quite. There's quite a big rise time in amplitude. Here's the speech spectrogram, which really doesn't give you the same picture of what might be important for the brain as if you look at the amplitude modulation structure. So now we've got amplitude on this axis, time along here, and then the different frequency bands are, in this range of speech, are color-coded. So the lower frequencies are in the reddish colors and the higher frequencies are in the bluish colors. And what you notice most is these very large fluctuations in amplitude that are in reddish colors. So in the lower frequency portion of the speech signal, you're getting these enormously salient changes in amplitude. They're also there at the higher frequencies, but the changes are not so large. And so that might make you think again, these speech registers are doing something important for language learning. They're really emphasizing these low frequency amplitude characteristics. So what we're showing is that you have another amplitude modulation cascade in natural speech used with young children. So all cultures seem to have some kind of rhythmic speech register that they use in the nursery. And the way we can think about this then, so this is again Mary, Mary, quite contrary with the amplitude envelope, but nested inside that envelope, so that skin around the apple, inside the apple, there are these 3 bands of amplitude modulations that are changing, and they're changing in time with each other, in synchrony, phase synchronization. And the plotting now, again, is this color-coded, so the lower frequencies in red, the higher frequencies in blue. And this is a schematic to show you the changes at this delta band rate. So we've got Mary, Mary, quite contrary. So you can see that there's an amplitude modulation peak for the stressed syllable, and then in the delta band there's a trough for the unstressed syllable. But at the theta rate, you get a peak for each syllable. So we've got Mary, Mary, quite contrary. And then, of course, at the faster rate, which in these nursery rhyme materials was centered on 20 hertz, you've got a lot more fluctuations. And the interesting finding in Vicky's PhD was that when you have 2 peaks, so you've got a delta peak and a theta peak, that's when you hear perceptually a strong stressed syllable. When you have a delta trough lined up with a theta peak, then you hear a weak syllable. So you need delta and theta together for speech rhythm. And how synchronized they are gives you the rhythmic structure of an utterance, the prosodic structure of that utterance. So this is another way of thinking about this, but it's basically arguing that phase hierarchies, in themselves, that statistical structure in speech, is giving the brain information that matters about phonology. So again, we've got our nursery rhyme with its envelope. We demodulate the envelope into these 3 bands, the fastest, theta and delta, and then you can think of a sort of idealized modulation at the delta band or an idealized modulation at the theta band. But what's happening perceptually is that when there are 2 peaks, you get a strong syllable. When there's a trough in delta and a peak in theta, then you get the weak syllable. And we were able to show that with a range of experimental methods. So this is really what matters for the brain in terms of perceiving speech rhythm. It's these amplitude modulation phase relationships. This is plotting it in a different way again, just to try and get the whole idea across. This is for single words now, so this is older work where we were looking at syllable stress recognition for 4-syllable words. So a word in English like comfortable has primary stress on the first syllable. An English word like debatable, that has primary stress on the second syllable. If we plot their amplitude modulation structure, so we've got the delta band, the theta band, and this faster band, then again we can see that for comfortable, where we get first syllable stress, you've got the peak in delta and the peak in theta aligned, and there's already a trough in delta for the second peak in theta, so that's an unstressed syllable, comfortable. Whereas for debatable, you've got the strong second syllable, and that's where the delta peak is. So the delta peak now is in line with the second theta peak. That's where you hear the strong syllable. So you can use this approach of amplitude modulation structure and phase relations at the single word level as well as at the phrasal level, and it matters. So with respect to early language acquisition and child development, this is very interesting because it's suggesting that here's a set of acoustic statistics that people haven't really thought about much before, but that could be absolutely core to children's individual differences in developing phonological awareness. Because we've got these very salient amplitude modulation clues. So again, we've got time along this axis, the different frequency bands in speech, and amplitude modulations where you can see, again, really salient amplitude cues to the stressed syllables, but also very noticeable cues to the other syllables in the utterance as well. So that would suggest that a child's brain who's sensitive to amplitude modulations and their rise times will automatically be extracting this structure. Because, of course, one reason that we called those bands delta, theta, and gamma is because we already know that that's the temporal rates at which there are networks of brain cells oscillating in your auditory cortex that are interested in amplitude modulations in speech. So it's no accident that the temporal rates are very similar. The brain obviously was evolved to be able to interpret the kind of speech we can produce as human speakers. So before I come on to the brain imaging, I want to talk about the second idea, which is that if this approach is correct, then we should be able to look back at all the child language tasks that we use to diagnose SLI or to diagnose dyslexia, and we should find some systematic amplitude modulation structure clues in those tasks. And so that was the second type of research we did, which was try and analyze child's tasks from this new perspective. So the first task we did was the Bradley and Brian Rhyme task, because Peter Brown was my PhD supervisor, and this is a task that they developed in the 70s to diagnose dyslexia, and of course it's gone across the world. This task has been used in so many languages now. But it was originally conceived of as a rhyme and alliteration task. So children hear 3 words like hill, pig, pin, and they're asked which word has a different sound at the beginning. So the classic way to give the task is to conceal your mouth so that you haven't got the complementary visual clues, and the child just has to listen and decide that hill is the odd one out. And then there were 2 versions of the rhyme task, because they either changed the vowel or they changed the final phoneme. But again, the child was just asked which word sounds different, cot, hat, hot, and the child should choose hat. Or which word doesn't rhyme, which is the odd one out, wood, good, book. You should choose book. So we applied this model of the amplitude modulation phase hierarchy structure of child-directed speech to the items in these tasks. So what we were basically doing was looking at the amplitude modulation structure of each word in terms of these 3 temporal bands and their phase synchronization, and then seeing which parameters were most similar between items that rhymed and which parameters differentiated items that didn't rhyme. So we used 2 techniques, mutual information and coherence, to look at phonological similarity structure, and the idea was, are there any consistent amplitude modulation cues that give you rhyme? And the results were very clear. It was all dependent on delta phase. So again, these are now plotted. We've got time along here, and we've got the different frequency bands. So lower frequencies in red, higher frequencies in these colors. You can see again, most of the amplitude modulation speech is in these lower frequency bands, below about 700 hertz. And this is for someone saying would, good, book. So these are the slowest amplitude modulations. These are the slightly faster in the theta band, and these are the faster ones. And what we then did was we ran some linear regressions to see which factors picked out rhyme similarity. And the key factor was delta phase. So it was the phase similarity between these 2 items was significantly greater than here. And you can sort of see that in these plots, because the overall color pictogram, as it were, looks a bit more similar for those 2 compared to that one. These 3 vary a bit more from each other. This is where there's the most similarity. And that's certainly what the statistics showed. Here's another example. This is nurse versus worth. So again, we've got the slowest amplitude modulations on the top panel, the faster ones in the middle, and the fastest here. And again, you can sort of see that, especially for the lower frequency bands, so this red and yellow, there's the most similarity between the 2 delta amplitude modulation structures. The non-rhyming item looks different from those 2. And across all of the different tokens that we analysed, it was delta phase across all the frequencies of speech, so not just the lower frequencies, including the higher frequencies, that determined rhyme similarity. And when we looked at children's errors, so we also had 100 children who'd done this rhyme oddity task, that same factor came out as a predictor of individual differences. This delta phase seems very important for rhyme similarity. Another task that's widely used in the dyslexia literature is so-called phoneme deletion, so that it's meant to be an oral task in that the child is told to think about a word and then say how it would be without one of the sounds. So say, for example, say hift without the f, that would leave the word hit. Or say glamp without the g, that would leave lamp. Or say cross without the t, and that would leave cross. So it's a so-called phoneme deletion. So you can model the items and the correct responses in terms of their amplitude modulation structure. And we also decided to look at child morphology. So this is a classic task from the literature, invented by Jean Berko, which is trying to elicit inflectional morphology of plurals. So the child is shown pictures. This is a wug. Oh look, now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two, and the child should say wugs. And most children do. So wug, wugs, or here's a gutch, now there are two of them, there are two gutches, or here's a niz, now there are two nizzes. So same thing, we decided to look at the amplitude modulation structure of the item and the correct response, and see whether we could find any systematic clues in the amplitude modulation structure to inflectional morphology and to phoneme deletion. And the basic answer is we found that it was the magnitude of the change in phase synchronization, again in these two slower frequency bands, the delta and theta rate modulations, that was the only systematic clue to both phoneme deletion and to plural elicitation. So this is the example of wug, this is the example of wugs. These are the plots in terms of what I showed you for the rhyme oddity, so you've got your delta band, theta band, faster band, and what the statistics are saying is that the change in this particular, in the phase synchronization between here and between here and here, that's what changes most systematically if you look at all the tokens in the particular test used. And this is plotting it in a different way, so now you've got the frequency bands of speech, so this is the slowest, this is the lowest, this is the highest, and you've got the phase synchronization index, and you've got wug in red and bugs in green, and you can see there's a bigger change across most of the frequency bands for the delta theta phase alignment compared to the faster phase alignment. So again, this is a statistical clue. You can't see it when you look at a model of the word or the item, but it's a very systematic cue across all the items used in the task. And again, it seems to be delta theta phase synchronization that's really important. So both of those lines of research suggest that the amplitude modulation structure of child-directed speech is different from the amplitude modulation structure of adult-directed speech. And probably that's for a reason, because this emphasizing the delta band information and delta theta phase synchronization is going to give you clues to prosodic structure, to rhyme, to phoneme, and also to some types of inflectional morphology. And I wanted to stress this because these are important insights for how all of us process speech, because it's about brains that can't yet read. Because the other thing that we've learned from research is that phonology, so your spoken language system, is fundamentally changed by learning to read. And once you can read, you can't ever put yourself back into how it was before you learned to read, because it then seems to be totally obvious that when you hear a word like potato, you're hearing p-o-t-a-t-o. But of course your brain didn't start there. It didn't start by hearing these grapheme phoneme connections. So I want to think a bit more about neural encoding of these amplitude modulations. And this work was pioneered by people like David Poppel and Joachim Gross. So it came from the adult neuroscience literature. But basically what these researchers have shown is that networks of neurons, particularly in your auditory cortex, but also in motor cortex, for example, which can only signal by firing an electrical potential. So they're either actively firing or they're inhibiting, they're recovering from firing, so they're inhibited, so you get oscillation from excitation to inhibition in one network at the delta rate, so that's roughly twice a second. Another oscillation from excitation to inhibition faster in the theta rate. So these are the rates that have been found in the brain, in auditory cortex and motor cortex, and shown to be entrained by incoming speech input. And there's actually an informational hierarchy in the brain, because the slowest rates of oscillation control the faster rates to some extent. So the phase of the delta oscillation will control the phase of the theta oscillation, and the phase of the theta oscillation, for example, will control the power of the response set gamma. So these things have been shown in the adult brain. If you don't have a neuroscience background, a way of thinking about this is using a metaphor of fireflies. So if you've ever seen fireflies in a forest at night, it's lots of random flickers, because the fireflies also can be either on or off. But if you imagine that the fireflies decided to all be in time with each other, then instead of seeing a lot of random flickers, you would get one big excitation where they're all on, and then a darkness when they're all off. So you get peaks and troughs of excitation, and that's basically what happens in the brain. So you can show that by recording from single cells in the brain. So this is an example of so-called local field potential. So you've got, this is time on this axis, and you've got all these individual cells spiking and recovering. But you can see that when you plot them at the group level, then you've got a nice oscillation going on. This one happens to be 10 hertz, so 10 times a second. And not only can you think of the individual neuron being excited or inhibited, but the whole network is being excited or inhibited in a rhythmic pattern, the oscillation. And what's also been shown is that once the speech signal comes in, so you might have all these relatively randomly oscillating cells in your network, but when that speech comes in, the brain uses the rise time of that envelope to reset the phase of the oscillation so that everyone's in time with each other. So we know that speech has a profound impact on these oscillations because it causes them to become entrained to the structure of the signal. In other words, instead of randomly firing, which they'll be doing even when you're asleep, of course, because this is the input from the environment, they all start firing in time with each other. So how is this relevant to reading and dyslexia? So I want to take a step back again and say, well, what have we learned in the last 100 years about dyslexia? Even though reading seems to be visual, and so it was thought that individual differences in children's visual abilities must be the reason why some of them can't learn to read. If you think about reading, although it's a visual code, that code is for speech written down. So your linguistic processing skills are bound to make a difference to how well you learn to read and spell. And of course we know that's the case. So from, again, decades of research, we know that in every language studied so far, it's individual differences in children's ability to become aware of phonology, so to become aware of the sound structure of words, that governs reading and spelling development for all typically developing children, but that is also impaired in children who have dyslexia. And we also know that developmentally there's a language universal sequence that children go through. So very young children, say 3-year-olds, they can do tasks like we looked at the rhyme oddity task, or you can have a syllable counting task. So these very young children can do tasks that manipulate large units of phonology like syllables and rhymes. And it's only as you learn to read, so it's not age dependent, it's literacy dependent, that children become reliably able to do phoneme awareness tasks like phoneme deletion. And that's been shown not just by looking at different ages at which literacy is taught, being linked to the different ages at which phoneme awareness develops, but you can also look at adults who've never learned to read, so illiterate adults, and they cannot do phoneme awareness tasks. So phoneme awareness, even though to all of us it seems like the most obvious thing you're doing when you're processing speech, no, it's something that comes because you've been taught to read. And sure enough, in dyslexia, the phonological deficit, as it's called, is not just at the phoneme level, it's at every level that we can think of looking for in the linguistic hierarchy. So children with dyslexia have more trouble becoming aware of stress syllable patterns, So a word like garden has a strong first syllable. That's harder for the child to hear perceptually. Syllable division, so garden has 2 syllables. Children with dyslexia find it hard to count syllables in words. Then this so-called onset rhyme division of the syllable, so you divide at the vowel. So the onset rhyme units, g, r, d, n. This is another parameter that these children with dyslexia have trouble hearing. They can't do rhyming tasks very well, and they can't do phoneme tasks. So if we're interested in the brain basis of dyslexia, the brain basis is presumably linked to phonology. It's linked to ways in which the child's linguistic system is structured that makes it difficult for them to pick out stressed syllables or prosodic structure, or syllables or rhymes, and long before they even have to struggle with learning phonemes. So as I said, I first got interested in rise time because I'd heard that it was a cue to speech rhythm. Turns out to be important for so many other aspects of language, in particular this idea that it's rise times that cause phase resetting of our oscillatory networks that encode the speech signal in the brain. So it's not a big step to think, well, if there are phonological difficulties in dyslexia and they're linked to rhythmic difficulties, linked to amplitude modulation and rise time, then maybe the way in which the brain encodes information about amplitude modulation structure is somehow different in the dyslexic brain. And that's what we've been looking at for the last decade or so in the centre. So just to remind you again, rise times, the essential meaning, so now we've got time on this axis, amplitude here, and the different frequency bands in speech here. And this is somebody saying the word 7, so 7. You can see that when they reach the first vowel, there's a big amplitude rise, this big amplitude modulation cue in these lower frequency regions that gives you the stressed syllable, and then there's a smaller rise time for the second stressed syllable. And children with dyslexia, if you give them a task based just on distinguishing rise times in a non-speech tone stimulus, they find it very difficult to do. So I had a decade of different PhD students from different countries, and we would give them these non-speech tasks, and they go back to their country and work with children with dyslexia. And in language after language, children with dyslexia had trouble discriminating these rise times. And it was particularly tough when the rise times were relatively extended over time. So the slower rise times were harder for children with dyslexia. So that would translate to the slower amplitude modulations. We also found at the linguistic level there was a speech rhythm problem. So just one example, we had a task called the DAAD task, in which you have familiar nursery rhymes or so-called famous names for children like Harry Potter, but instead of giving them the speech, you give them the prosodic structure using just one syllable, the syllable D. So Harry Potter should be strong, weak, so that would be D, 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 D. Or Jack and Jill went up the hill, D, 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 D. And the task was that we just had pictures of Harry Potter or Jack and Jill, and the children would listen to a DD sequence and had to say if it was the name of the picture. So if it was DD, that would be Harry Potter. And we found that the children with dyslexia were reliably worse at this. So it's not that they can't do it at all, but they do find it much more difficult than other children. And if you measure them young enough, so in our case 9-year-olds, they're actually worse than 7-year-old children matched for reading level. So when you match for reading level, you're trying to equate the reading experience of the brain. So you're giving the cognitive advantage to the child with dyslexia because they've got a higher mental age, they're 9, they're not 7. But they're worse than the younger children at this task. Same thing with general rhythm perception, so that's actually where I started in this research program, but we just were looking at general rhythm awareness, tapping in time with a metronome, tick, tick, tick. So the child's got a little stick or taps with their finger, tap, tap. And again, we would find that children with dyslexia were out of time, so they weren't able to synchronize with an external beat, as well as children who didn't have dyslexia. Even students here at Cambridge, if you give them this task, they don't synchronize with the beat as well as other students who don't have dyslexia. And so the idea was there's something really intrinsically connected about rhythm processing and phonology. So the idea is rhythmic awareness is poor, it's a critical aspect of phonological development, But given that non-speech rhythm is also affected, it's probably something in the rhythm processing system in the human brain. And to think about this, I found very useful a model that was first proposed by David Popple. So he was talking about how, although we have no conscious experience of this because everything's bound together for speech perception, there's multi-time resolution of the incoming signal by the human brain. So his initial model was particularly based on these two networks, gamma and theta, so rapidly modulating, oscillating networks and slower oscillating networks, which he showed were related to phoneme versus syllable perception. So he said the speech signal comes in, your brain divides up its task. One network is interested in the slow modulations, one's interested in the faster modulations. But you never realize that because you just get the perfect percept, you hear speech. And so when we started this work, I was predicting a problem here, but in fact, in study after study, the problem has always been in the delta network for children with dyslexia. And so I expanded the model to also think about these slower oscillations, which we've seen are related to some extent to extracting information about stress syllables. And so then the hypothesis was, would we be able to find problems in the entrainment of slower oscillating networks in their brain by amplitude modulation information or rhythmic information? So is there some problem for children in this portion of the signal? And the first study we did was really simple. It was just rhythmic speech. So it's an experimenter saying ba, 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 ba. So it's just one syllable, and she could hear a metronome in her ear, so she was saying it at a perfect 2 Hertz rate. But every now and again, one syllable would be out of time. So it wouldn't be at 2 Hertz. And the child was sitting there and they had to press a button each time they thought she was out of time. And so we would either present audio-visual speech, which is the normal talking head, or auditory only, so they couldn't see, they could just hear ba, 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 with one of them out of time now and then, or visual speech only. So they could see and had to work out which one was out of time through the visual route. And then we could match the children for their performance in the task before we did the brain imaging. So what we were looking for was significant entrainment of delta and theta rate responding networks on different electrodes. So FZ is often the electrode most associated with auditory cortex function. And if this was a straight line and all of the bins were the same height, then that would be no entrainment. It would be just totally random responding. But whenever you get this dip, so this is from minus pi to pi, so it's thinking about a whole oscillatory cycle. If you get this dip, it means you've got significant entrainment. And sure enough, we found significant entrainment for typically developing children on visual electrodes for visual speech, on auditory electrodes for auditory and auditory visual speech. And it's very clear their brain was doing this. What's also interesting, so this is intratrial coherence in the theta band, and this is children's reading. And this is just a typically developing group, but we found that the quality of theta entrainment was related to reading. So as you got better at reading, you also showed better theta rate entrainment. Then we looked at children with dyslexia in the same paradigm. So this is the auditory speech alone, visual speech alone, audio visual. This is another auditory electrode CZ, and you can see across here, dyslexic in red, chronological age controls in blue. So these vectors are basically plotting when is most of the network responding. So the preferred phase, or the most oscillation, the most excitation is at that point. And you can see that both vectors are equally long, so it's not that the dyslexic brain is not responding as powerfully as the control brain, but there's a significant time difference for the audio-visual and the audio input only. There's nothing much visually. For the visual speech, you can see there's quite a good response, but it's absolutely the same for both groups. So there was a significant difference in the preferred phase of the brain if you were a dyslexic child or not. So the way to think about this is the dyslexic brain is firing, when it's to the stimulus, but it's doing it out of time. In fact, another way of thinking about this is to plot phase as a circle. So this is now as it were 0, going all the way around to 360. And now the length of the petals is showing you the degree of response by the brain. And so the longest petal, or the preferred phase, is in red. And again, you can see that it's different between the two groups. So there was nothing wrong with visual processing of speech in this study. It was all anything. As soon as the auditory modality was involved, the dyslexic brain seemed out of time. So if we go back to our Jack and Jill, so this is Jack and Jill went up the hill. One way of thinking about this is that the dyslexic brain, the optimal response in the brain is not at the time when there's the optimal information in the speech signal. It's always slightly out of time. And so that means the quality of the information your brain is encoding, at least by hypothesis, is going to be lower because you're getting the maximal excitation at a time when there's actually less information in the speech signal. And given that I've shown you that there's a hierarchy not just in the oscillatory response of the brain but also in the information in speech, if the top level of that hierarchy is not in time, then it's going to have cascading effects throughout the whole hierarchy. So not only will it affect your speech rhythm experience, it will also affect things like where are the syllables, where are the rhymes. To try and look at this more directly, so to look directly at the quality of the phonological representation, I should have said this is all work with Alan Power, who was an acoustic engineer, he really did great work on my grant. We decided to ask children to listen to unfamiliar sentences, so they were grammatically accurate, but you couldn't necessarily predict what words were going to come, like arcs through their cough. And we also vocoded the speech to make it that bit harder, so they were having to recognize noise vocoded speech, which does require more reliance on the amplitude envelope information. And the children just had to repeat back what they heard. And we were interested in whether we could then recreate the envelopes in the stimulus, so say the 2 Hertz envelope in someone saying arcs through their cough, whether we could recreate that from the brain response. So it's a kind of reverse engineering from the brain response to the original stimulus. And that should show you the quality of encoding. And this is the results, so that's reconstruction accuracy here. These are the different frequency bands we looked at, so 0 to 2 Hertz is delta, then we get some theta bands. And we also had reading level matched children in this study. So again, we had younger children who had read much, who had reached the same level of reading as the dyslexics, but who had much less, as it were, life experience and language experience. And at the behavioural level, the reading level matched children and the dyslexic children could report the same number of sentences accurately. The chronological age matched children could do more. But if you look at the brain level, so this is the representational level, you can see that the children with dyslexia are showing a less accurate encoding of that delta band envelope compared to both of the control groups. So this was significantly different here and here. And so this is really strong evidence that it's at the level of the encoding that the dyslexic brain is running into problems. Remember, this is a purely automatic process. You can't choose to control it. But if we think of the 3 groups, so this is chronological age controls, dyslexic reading level controls. Here's the envelope of a particular sentence in the delta band in black, and here's the brain patterns used to recreate that envelope in green. You can see actually the most fidelity is shown by the youngest children. So that's probably because they've got less top-down information they can use to help them work out these sentences. But it's also very clear that it's the dyslexic brain that is showing the poorest quality of encoding of the stimulus. Because remember, this is the brain response, and it's a brain response for this particular envelope, and it's really all over the place. It's not as precise and tightly faithful to the stimulus as the other children. Last brain study, or at least I should speed up a bit because you said 10 minutes. We've also looked at where this is happening in the brain, so EEG is not so good for that, but we have got a NIRS system, and we can measure blood flow changes. So again, you have to do paradigms where you're measuring blood flow over a relatively slow time course, but you can have, in this study we used amplitude modulated noise, so you've got a rhythmic input, but we had it either slow, so 2 Hertz, kind of shh, 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 or much faster, which was gamma band, 40 Hertz. And we did find differences in the children, but for the slow rhythmic noise only. So there was a difference in blood flow at these sites in the left and the right cortex. But once you corrected for multiple corrections, it was really these right hemisphere loci that were most important. Right marginal, supramarginal gyrus, which some adult studies suggest is active in prosodic processing. So that's where the main site of the group difference was for that study. You can also use MEG, which gives you much better quality information. We did that with some undergraduates here. So we've got slower and faster rates, again, of amplitude modulated noise, this type of input. What we found was that the delta band response, the intertrial coherence for delta band was significantly worse in the dyslexics compared to the controls. But then they showed compensation in the left hemisphere for the faster rates. So this is just to give you a flavour of how complex this whole question is going to be, because even if there's something going wrong in one level of the brain, say delta band entrainment, that's only part of an overall percept which is bound together from lots of other information as well, some of which the brain might be representing extra well as compensation. So I just wanted to make that point again, that it's really important to think about these things, because we shouldn't have a literature in cognitive neuroscience that's based totally on the highly literate adult brain. Everything does change when the brain learns to read. And in fact, we showed this recently in a study. So we had a master's student come over from Portugal, in Portugal there's a whole tranche of adults who never learned to read as children because there was no schools. So they lived in these remote communities, there was nothing wrong with their IQ, but they never learned to read. And we were able to go to these illiterate adults. They were all women in their 70s by now, so we matched them with other people in their 70s who'd been through university or who had low literacy, had just done 4 years of schooling. And this shows you, again, illiterate, low literate, and high literate, the amount of phase synchronization in their natural conversational speech. So they were just chatting to the experimenter. And for the natural conversational speech, we actually got a significant difference. It's almost a parametric effect of literacy in the amount of delta theta phase synchronization. It was much stronger in the two literate populations. And this wasn't something to do with physiology. It wasn't that the illiterates couldn't choose to be rhythmic, because when we asked them to recite proverbs from childhood, which were very rhythmic proverbs, then they were very good at it. Then there's no group differences at all in phase synchronization. But in natural speech, you get these significant differences. And the significant differences are also there, although there's less synchronization overall, but for the faster rates, so theta and beta low gamma, again you can see there's a difference, particularly between high literates and low literates, in the amount of phase synchronization, just in conversational speech, but it's not different when you ask them to deliberately speak rhythmically. So it's really making the complexity of this area larger, because we've got to think about not just who's speaking, but what you're speaking about. I'll just finish in a couple of slides to talk about what this means for remediating developmental dyslexia. So I've given you a range of neural data suggesting there's something going wrong with the slow delta band entrainment of this information in the speech signal, and that's information relevant to rhythm and prosodic structure. So what that could mean is that if you really do overt extra activities based on speech rhythm, this will help children with dyslexia to improve their phonological awareness, which will in turn have consequences for reading. And I was very struck when I watched a program on, so when Danny Boyle did the English Olympics, the opening ceremony, one of his things was the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know if you remember, but he had 1,000 drummers, and they all had to drum on these dustbins. And I was watching this program about how they made the ceremony, and he said there was only one day to train these drummers to be in time. But the guy who was training them said, it's easy, I just taught them this sentence. And as long as they had that in their head, they could drum in time. So they had to do, play the drum so your mum can see you on TV. Play the drum so your mum. And once they could do that, they got it. So, a way of thinking about dyslexia is it's the inversion of that, that these children with dyslexia would find that incredibly difficult. But of course, drumming is more rhythmic than speaking, and so maybe we could, as it were, entrain their oscillatory systems by deliberately using musical activities, motor activities, things using more than one modality based on rhythm, but always linking to rhythmic structure of speech. So always linking to prosodic patterns, syllable stress, rhythmic patterning, which of course lots of things that children like to do will achieve, and also things that used to happen more in the playground, like skipping, girls skipping games. All of these things are natural ways in which children are, as it were, enhancing their own oscillators to really entrain to these fundamental aspects of the speech signal and then have better reading outcomes. We have got a poster here. I hope you'll go and look at it, because the other thing we're trying to do now in my most recent grant is to try and change the speech signal to amplify these rise times and these delta band amplitude modulation information that the dyslexic brain doesn't seem to really be getting as well automatically as the typically developing brain, to see if we can help these children to hear the phonological structures and information in speech better, with a view to that impacting their reading. So that's a poster. And then the other study we're doing is trying to study this really from the very beginning. So with an ERC grant, we've recruited 100 infants aged from 2 months of age, and we're giving them very simple inputs, so that same pa, syllable repetition task. There's a drum beat, just to look at non-speech rhythm, and then there's also listening to nursery rhymes being sung to them. Because of course when you're singing, you've got the perfect alignment of all these amplitude modulations, because you're timing your own output to an external beat. So in terms of the brain, that should be an optimal input stimulus, which can predict language development. So I'll come back in 5 years and I'll tell you if it works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good thoughts. Time for a couple of questions.
Very nice talk. I enjoy your perspective. From what you're saying, basically there shouldn't be much difference between children with language disorder and dyslexic individual.
I think there are differences, because we know there are behaviourally, but I think what we need to look at is the nesting of phrases in speech in terms of amplitude modulation structures and durational pausing. Because I've had a couple of PhD students who've looked at SLI children, and they have a rise time problem, but it doesn't necessarily look the same as the children with dyslexia. And we've tried different rhythmic language experiments with them, and they have a lot of problem with phrasing structure, which is often packed with syntactic information, like you'll pause at the end of a syntactic phrase, for example. So I think the problem could be at a different level of the system for these children, and I'm still trying to get someone to give me money to find out.
But it's still a question of being out of phase.
Correct, but the key thing is that that can happen at many levels in this oscillatory hierarchy. So you might show overall that you're insensitive to rise time, but the effect that has on your brain might be at one of the faster levels, for example, of oscillations. It would still mean your overall percept is different from everybody else. So your brain's doing something automatic that gives you a different percept, and that could then have different effects on what parts of language you can parse syntactically. The real gold standard would be to do the same thing across languages in SLI. That's happened in dyslexia, but I haven't seen much in SLI, because it shouldn't be so much, is it, I don't know, inflection or morphology. It should be, how does that language realize particular things in terms of amplitude modulation structure.
Another question?
Hi. So you're finding that dyslexic brainwaves are out of time. It's very interesting. I'm wondering if that means that all we need to do is to manipulate our stimulus and delay it so that the important information arrives at the right point in time. Because we can calculate that moment based on the phase difference between the two.
Sure, so it was only 12.8 milliseconds difference in that bar study. But I think you'd have to do it for the delta band by itself, because I think there's no evidence in those data that the theta band isn't in time. So at least come to the poster, because what we're planning to do with Sheila, who's somewhere in the audience, is do signal processing, starting off by trying to change that delta band information. So make the rise times bigger, obviously, but also make that whole envelope more salient.
Final question.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. This is sorry, going beyond language. If I understand you correctly, there's a phasing problem with language. And I'm just wondering, is that specific to language, or is there a phasing problem in the brain with all timing processes? So imagine the link either with music, which is, I'm assuming that's different, and dyspraxia, and the timing, how well people dance, or so is language just a signal of a general timing problem, or is the timing specific to that?
I think it's a general problem. So I don't have as much data on other modalities as I have on the auditory, but certainly at the motor level, their tapping is out of time. But if we look at the brain, what's happened? So we train some dyslexics to tap as well to a beat as control children, but the auditory brain response was still out of phase. So that's driving the motor timing. So yes, these people say to us, I can't dance, or I hate dancing, or they say, I can play my instrument, but I can't be in the orchestra because it's very hard to come in on time. So there are general effects, but yeah, still an open question in that sense. But I think a long time ago, Alvin Lieberman said, human behavior that's metrically organized, any temporal human behavior. I think he was really right on the button.
We should thank our speaker.
Thank you.
We will now move to the next talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Claudia Abreu Lopez. She's an affiliated lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Claudia led the pilot research project at the Center of Governance and Human Rights here, which led to the establishment of Africa's Voices Foundation. She's trained as a social psychologist, and she has several years of experience working in Africa on research projects related to new technologies and audience interactivity. And she was also research advisor for the project Epidemics, Digital Media and Health Communications in Africa. So here's the floor.
Thank you very much. So the project I'm going to present today was supposed to be presented by the research lead, Dr. Joanna Ria, but she's based in Tanzania and she couldn't travel here today, so I'm presenting on her behalf. So I'm a research advisor of the project. So this project is a project funded by Wellcome Trust and DFID, and we want to understand how can we use an interactive radio and SMS tool to inform health emergencies in the south central region of Somalia. So this project is focusing on a cholera outbreak. So there's no cholera outbreak in south central Somalia at the moment, but there was very recently. So we want to understand how we can use this new tool to inform and to understand the preparedness of the populations for a possible outbreak. So this presentation is going to be divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the context of health emergencies and the need to have a type of data that is more about communities' public opinion to plan and to develop appropriate and contextual relevant outbreak response plans. And as I said, with a focus on the cholera in south central Somalia. In the second part, I'm going to talk about the digital communications aspect of this research that has to do with this new tool, new method that Africa Voices Foundation has been developing for several years that is combining interactive radio and SMS. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that are related with language sciences. So the data that we receive is textual data with dialects, with aggregation of words because it's SMS language, and we have several challenges and problems in terms of processing this data that we believe that the language sciences will give a contribution. So in terms of the context of these public health emergencies, in the last 30 years we have seen an increase on the number of outbreaks, and unfortunately we won't expect the situation to change in the next 30 years. So, and this is because of a variety of reasons, that it can be related with climate change, it can be related with migration movements or antimicrobial resistance. So all these factors together will make us more vulnerable to infectious diseases outbreaks in the next, I would say, decades. So there are some lessons that were learned in relation to the Zika and Ebola outbreaks in 2014, and this year there was a Ebola outbreak in DRC. So some of these lessons, they show the need to integrate more social context and information about these communities into these outbreak plans for the preparedness response. So these public health interventions, they have been focusing mainly on the epidemiological and medical aspects of the outbreaks and not taking enough attention to the knowledge and to the responses that people in the communities have already for these problems. So these recent infectious diseases outbreaks have shown us clearly that we need new tools to understand and to plan for some of these problems in the future. And one possible combination of these tools is to combine this epidemiological and medical research with more qualitative and quantitative social and behavioral science tools. And we believe that when we complement these tools together, we will have a response that is more rapid, more effective, and more targeted and more aligned with the responses that are needed for these populations. And here is just one quote to show what are the risks of not considering enough this knowledge of the communities and not engaging enough with them. So this is an example of the Ebola outbreak, where some of the government officials and the external agencies were there was some violence related to the way that people in certain communities, for example in Sierra Leone, they, in a way that they deal with them, they interact with them, and all because there was not enough attention paid to the appropriate local engagement with the communities, and these solutions were coming, the medical solutions were coming from above and not respecting the traditions and the cultures of these communities. So we know and we all learn that this needs to be done. So in terms of the language sciences, these tools, and that they are the digital tools when we combine the interactive radio and SMS, they pose specific challenges. And these challenges, they are related with languages that are not well studied. We can talk about low or no resource languages if you think about Somali. And there are also regional differences and dialects in these languages. And some of these languages, they are also oral languages, so they don't have a written form that it can be used by all the populations, the audiences that are providing the data, and this poses other problems in terms of the processing of information for this research. So in terms of health crisis and this digital media, this usually, the way that these messages and the interaction with the populations have been approached in the past is in terms of the unidirectional and message out, to send messages to the populations to tell them what is the appropriate course of action if someone is infected or has some signs of Ebola, but they don't receive what are the reactions and the responses of the communities in relation to this advice. So with the interactive radio, this is possible. So interactive radio means that there's a radio show that the communities are exposed to, and through this radio show, there are some space for discussion where the communities can send an SMS that is free to the radio show, and because there are some technology that allows to the presenters in the radio show to see the messages that people are sending in real time. It's possible to have a discussion on the airwaves where people can challenge their behavior and they can learn from the others. So they are real spaces for discussion, and this can be captured with this new digital media. There's also some persistent belief that lay people, they don't know enough about these health issues in their communities, and they need solutions from experts who are sitting in a lab, in their offices. They will tell them what to do, and not always this advice is taken in a very positive way from these communities, because they have their own solutions, their own decision-making processes, and they want to use these local solutions to tackle their own problems. So we would like, when we thought about this interactive radio and SMS method, we always try to contrast it with the traditional methods. And the traditional methods in terms of public health are representative surveys, household surveys. And the household surveys, they are immensely, I would say, rigorous in terms of that they are representative of the population. So if you want to know what is a prevalence of a symptom in a population, we need to use a representative method. But these surveys, they are not as good as understanding these community level beliefs. So they are good at getting information about practices, about individual attitudes, but not what the community thinks as a whole, and what are the types of beliefs that are triggered during a discussion in the railways, because this is the way that people talk about the diseases and the symptoms. So, by contrast, these digital methods that combine interactive radio with SMS, we think that they can gather this gamut of beliefs, community health beliefs, and at the same time they are interactive. So whether in a household survey we have an interviewer that asks questions to interviewees, so there's no social context apart from the interaction between two people, in the interactive radio is a real space with a real context for interaction. So even if you are not doing this research with these communities, these spaces were